Hold me now in the hands that created the heavens. Find me now where the grace runs as deep as your scars. You pulled me from the clay, set me on a rock, and called me by your name, made my heart whole again. Lifted up, and my knees know it's all for your glory, that I might stand with more reason to sing than to fear. You pulled me from the clay, set me on the rock, and called me by your name, made my heart whole again. Here I stand, high in surrender. I need you now. Hold my heart now and forever. My soul cries out. Once I was broken, but you loved my whole heart through. Sin has no hold on me, 'cause your grace holds me now. And that grace owns the ground where the grave did, where all my shame remains, left for you dead and you wake. You crashed those angel gates, you left no stones unturned. You stepped out of that grave and shouldered me all the way. So here I stand, high in surrender. I need you now. Hold my heart now and forever. My soul cries out. Once I was broken, but you loved my whole heart through. Sin has no hold on me, and the grace holds me now. Healed and forgiven. Look where my chains are now. Death has no hold on me, 'cause your grace holds my ground, and your grace holds me now. 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 So here I stand, high in surrender. I need you now. Hold my heart now and forever. My soul cries out. Once I was broken, but you loved my whole heart through. Sin has no hold on me, 'cause the grace holds me now. Healed and forgiven. Look where my chains are now. Death there's no hold on me, 'cause your grace holds that ground, and your grace holds me now. 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 And your grace holds me now. Your grace holds me now. Your grace holds me now. Your grace holds me now.
If we've not met, My name is Rob Peterson, and I'm a Canadian, just wanted to let you know that. I am the interim president superintendent of the Canada Covenant, and in that role, I visit churches, I preach sometimes, I encourage pastors, I help churches find new pastors, I oversee a staff of 9 across Canada that really exist to help Canada Covenant start and strengthen churches and serve and support pastors and leaders. That's sort of our driving passion, is to be a support enterprise, denomination that exists for the flourishing of the local church. So that's me. I come to this place from Grand Rapids, Michigan. You might wonder, how is that possible that an interim superintendent lives in the United States and is overseeing a Canadian denomination? That's another story for another day, but that's where I come from. But I want to start by saying thank you to City Collective. You may not know this, but you are not an independent congregation. You are part of a family of churches, about 38 across Western Canada, 3 camps and a foundation. And together, we're able to do more than you can do all by yourself. And so we work together to do all kinds of things, to see people come to faith in Christ, to see young adults discipled and mentored, to see churches started, to see churches flourish. And it's our work together that I think makes a significant difference as we try to be a winsome witness in this neighborhood and in all the neighborhoods where we have churches in Canada. So when Pastor Jason invited me to preach a couple of months ago, he does like to plan ahead. That's always nice. He asked me, I said, well, can I join a series that you're doing? He said, for sure. We're doing a series on what? Grief. And in my mind, I immediately said, yes. There aren't too many churches that I know that will lean into the universal human experience of loss. So I wouldn't say I'm delighted to talk about grief today, but I think it's the right thing. Probably what we have in common, all of us, more than anything, is the fact that all of us hold complex realities in our life. Some of us hold significant loss. So I'm glad to be able to hold with you this beautiful little book, the book of Ruth, that addresses this topic of grief and God being present with us. So I'm just really glad to be here. So the book of Ruth, and this is my personal little opinion, you may not know the Bible very well, and that's okay. But it is nestled in right after a book called Judges, and right before the history of God's people, 1st and 2nd Samuel. This little book of 4 chapters is put right between Judges. And if you know anything about the book of Judges, it is a grand narrative of darkness. It is the story after story after story of God's people turning away from God and pursuing their own agendas, their own leaders, and they spiral both nationally and spiritually deeper and deeper into darkness and chaos. The last verse of the book of Judges is this. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit, meaning everybody did what they saw fit, and it was not good in the eyes of God. And then along comes, so you have this grand narrative of darkness spiraling out of control, chaos. And then those who decided to put the scriptures together said, let's put this gospel story of Ruth right after the dark story of Judges. And so Ruth is this little story of 4 brief chapters, and there's 3 characters. Boaz, a faithful farmer. Naomi is a grieving widow, and Ruth is a foreign Moabite. It doesn't seem like a significant story, but I would say it is a beautiful gospel good news story. But it starts with heartache. Jason shared a couple weeks ago, as did Pastor Rita Jeet, that the story starts with incredible heartbreak. Naomi, because of famine, leaves Bethlehem and goes to Moab. And there, of course, her sons marry Moabite women. But her husband dies, and then her 2 sons die. And it's Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. And it seems like the story's over. They're in profound grief as the book of Ruth opens up. I think the book of Ruth, if you ask me, is trying to answer a question. The whole book is trying to answer this question: where is God when we suffer? If you have followed Jesus for any length of time, even if you haven't followed Jesus, but you're curious about Jesus, I am pretty sure that you have asked this question: where is God when things don't go well? You may have wondered, does God cause the suffering in our world? It can feel like that. Does God allow suffering? Does God judge us through suffering? Is God trying to teach us something through suffering? When life is good, we can have a sense that God is our companion. That things of blessing is good and God is close by. But when our heart is broken open by loss, we can feel as if now God has taken a trip. Like a parent watching their child in a playground, and they get distracted for a few seconds and their child falls off the swing and gets injured, we can feel like there are times in our life where God got distracted and something terrible happened to us. If God had only paid attention to my life, this horrible thing that's happened wouldn't have happened. So where is God when we encounter hardship? My answer this morning is, I don't fully know. I know that's not very inspiring, but that's the honest truth. The mystery and the problem of suffering in the world has been around for millennia. And I'm not here today to say I now understand all of this. It is a mystery of why God's people, and all people in general, have seasons of great hardship. But the book of Ruth, and this is why I think it's such good news, the book of Ruth offers a compelling suggestion to the question of where is God when loss happens. It offers us, I think, some good news. The book of Ruth answers this question this way: where is God when grief comes? God is everywhere. Or more precisely, where is God? The answer, according to Ruth, is that God is close at hand. The grief story of Naomi and Ruth is undergirded and interwoven with God's story. And they're not separate stories. God fully present, grief fully present together. Psalm 34 says this: the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. That's where God is for Naomi. Not distant, but close. But there's even more. So if we answer the question according to the book of Ruth, where is God in suffering? And we say God is close to the brokenhearted, the book of Ruth adds another dimension that sometimes we have to kind of struggle with. And that is, how is God? Like, where is God? How do I see God's presence in the time of suffering? And what we get in the book of Ruth is that God is hidden. The book of Ruth, nowhere in the book of Ruth, apart from the very end of it when God gives Ruth, the ability to conceive. Nowhere in the book does God come crashing into the story and say, I'm here to help. There's no prophetic word. There's no teacher from the outside. There's no visiting preacher that comes and says, God is with you. What we get in the book of Ruth is how God is present through people of loyalty and loving kindness. But it's not obvious that God is present. And that's part of what's going on in this story of the book of Ruth. God is present, but you kind of have to look a little closer, and you begin to see as you look at these characters like Boaz and Ruth that they represent the unfailing hesed, loving kindness of God. So God is present, and God is moving these two women through their grief toward hope. And God does that through community. So for all of us here this morning, that if you're grieving, we see you. For all of us who are here that you're not grieving, it's going to come again. There will be a loss. For we claim to follow Jesus, and Jesus says, no, there's no spiritual bypass. You can't go around. You can't go around these things. If you're going to follow me, Jesus says, you must take up my life, my pattern, which is always to enter into suffering and then to find hope through suffering. So, God is in the midst of our grieving. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, if you know anything about the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you will know that he suffered immensely for standing against Nazism in the 1940s leading up to the end of the war. And he took a stand against this. He was a Christian, a Lutheran pastor, and he took a stand to say what is happening and unfolding in the countries that he was a part of, in Europe, in particular Germany, had nothing to do with God. It was evil. And so he takes a stand. He is captured, he's imprisoned, and he writes out of prison. If you ever want a very sobering read, Letters and Papers from Prison by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But in that book, he has this line. As he thinks about his predicament and the suffering that the Jewish people were having, mass murdered, he says, only the suffering God can help. Only the suffering God can help those of us who are suffering. God does not stand at a distance to our grief, but the scriptures tell us through Christ, God has entered the very grief, the very darkness of the darkest you can imagine. God has entered there. So, the story of Ruth, chapter 3. 2 weeks ago, Pastor Jason highlighted beautifully that as this book opens, you get a couple of things we notice in chapter 1, that Naomi is invited to lament. And she changes her name from Naomi to Mara, meaning bitter. And in this chapter, Mara bitterly says to God, what's going on? And Pastor Jason highlights that this tradition of speaking our grief to God is a form of lament, which we find all through the biblical text, that it's more than appropriate for us to say, God, you don't seem anywhere close, even though God is in the midst of everything. Our perception might be clouded. So we hear Naomi offer lament to God. We also hear, as Pastor Jason said, that God was present for Naomi through Ruth. And then last week, Pastor Rita Jeet, pastor in Surrey, is that right? Yeah, okay. She shared that God, in the midst of our grief, God's unfailing love is expressed through the presence of community. And now this morning, I want us to look at chapter 3. There is an emerging presence of hope that enables Naomi, as you'll see in a minute, to continue on in her grief journey. It is possible for her to take the next step, but it's only possible because there's a little bit of hope that comes to her to be able to take the next step in her journey. The intensity of grief, it does subside. There's no timeline for grief. Whatever grief you're experiencing, whatever loss has come your way, there's no, you do it in this season and then you put grief aside and now you're into the season of non-grief. That's not how grief works. When we experience profound loss, whether it's the death of a loved one or the death of a dream or all kinds of losses, grief comes and goes. It's not something you set aside. It becomes more like a companion. And in those early weeks and months when you have experienced loss, that companion of grief is front and center, and that's all you can see. It's intense. It's overwhelming. But in time, grief moves off to the side. And you can see, and you're able to take some steps back into normal living. But grief is always there. It'll always be our companion. And sometimes because of a word from somebody else, or a story, a memory, being at a certain place, that grief comes right back, and it feels like you're right back in the intensity of grief. That's how it happens. But for Naomi, she experiences a little bit of hope through Boaz. And I'll explain that in a minute. I believe it's hope that heals and offers us an invitation to look beyond ourselves and back into life that is in front of us. So hope comes to Naomi through Boaz, who is a loyal, faithful farmer. He's a relative. He had looked out for Ruth. He allowed Ruth in his field. The last 2 weeks you heard about that part of the story. Boaz allows Ruth to glean the leftovers from the crop, and she collects that, provides for Naomi. And it's Boaz. It's his character. And Naomi says of Boaz in chapter 2, verse 20. This is what Naomi says of Boaz. The Lord bless his socks off. That's my paraphrase. The Lord bless him. Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, he has not stopped showing kindness. That's the key word in the book of Ruth, kindness. It's a Hebrew word. I already shared it. Hesed. It's like a tough, unfailing compassion. That's what it is. Boaz has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. And she added, that man is our close relative. He's one of our guardian redeemers. Naomi, through the character and the loyalty and the compassion of Boaz, is offered care and a little bit of hope. Boaz has been Boaz, and it's through the provision of Boaz, it's through the presence of Boaz, it's through the presence and interest and care of Boaz toward Ruth. It's through his protection. That sounds a lot like God to me. Through Boaz, Naomi has experienced a little bit of life, and she's ready now to take a step. But let me pause here. When I think about journeying with people who grieve, when I think about walking with people who are bent low because of loss, even if it's uncomfortable for you, and grief can be very uncomfortable, the best we can do is not so much our words, but it's our presence. Boaz's presence, in a way, radiates out and brings hope to two grieving women. So I think the best we can do when we walk alongside those, as I said, are bent low because of grief, has nothing to do with words, has to do with presence. If you wonder, and I've had people ask me, Pastor Rob, what do I say to my family member who is lost? I don't know what to say. And I say, that's really good. How about nothing? Just be present. That's the power that we bring into the complexity and the darkness of grief. Erin, a little girl who's with Jesus, she died on her 28th day of life. Her parents were part of a congregation that I served quite a few years ago. Erin was born with a rare genetic disorder that would take her life within a month. What do you do? What do you say to parents? There's nothing you can say to take away the fear. But I am so proud of that congregation of about 50 people. They knew that words weren't that important, but they knew that presence was. And so around the clock, for 28 days, this little congregation would show up in a timely manner at that house for those parents, and they would hold that little girl that she would never ever put down. She was held for 28 days. And they brought meals to this family. They didn't do a lot of talking. They were like Boaz. Loyal, compassionate, loving kindness. That, I think, is a lesson I take from this book. That when you wonder, where is God in the suffering and the hardship? He's everywhere where God's people will practice the presence of loving kindness. So that's the first thing I notice in our story today. So one day, the text says, Naomi is hopeful enough to see that a critical need is coming up. And the critical need that Naomi sees, even though she's a grieving widow, she's lost husband and 2 sons. She's experienced the care of Boaz, but she notices that if something doesn't happen for Ruth, who is a widow, her daughter-in-law, that she will be in jeopardy. And so she comes up with a plan. And this is what she says in verse 1 of chapter 3. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." In the ancient world, if you were widowed, a woman, it's like you're invisible in the ancient world. There's no social network. It's you either have a connection to a family. She's a foreigner, remember? She has no family in Israel. She's a Moabite. If somebody doesn't step up and do something for Ruth, her long-term well-being will be called into question. And so Naomi, an Israelite, she recognizes, Boaz. And so she schemes a plan. But she has enough hope in her own grief story to be able to look beyond herself to the care and the need of her daughter-in-law, Ruth. Now, the thing that she comes up with, the plan that she comes up with, is one of the most puzzling stories in the Old Testament. And I'll read it to you in a minute, but is it comical, what she does? As you'll see in a moment. Is it seductive? Is it romantic? We don't know, but here's the plan. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, she's talking to Ruth, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. It's about 7 weeks later. Harvest is done. Okay, it's all piled up on the threshing floor. It's there. And there's a big party. Okay, that's what's going on. Wash, put on perfume, get dressed in your best clothes. Some scholars think take off your mourning clothes, as in not like mourning, but your grieving clothes, and put on normal clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know that you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying, then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. That's quite a plan. I'm not sure that I could think of that plan, but anyway. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and he was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Ruth, who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. The Lord bless you, my daughter, Boaz said. This kindness is greater than which you have shown earlier. You have not run after younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of your family, there is another who is more closely related than I am. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here till morning. That is an amazing story. It might be of interest to us to attempt to unravel this story and answer culturally what is actually going on in this story. And I'm here to say we could be wrong. I could be wrong if I offer you this is what's going on in the story, because here's why. There are people a whole lot smarter than me who have looked at this story from all kinds of cultural and ancient lenses and say we're not absolutely sure what is going on the threshing floor. Is it a proposal of Ruth to Boaz? Is it something different than that? What is going on? And what I've come to believe, it doesn't essentially matter how we understand this midnight rendezvous. But what matters is what the people say. It matters what Ruth says, and it matters what Boaz says. Here's what Ruth says again. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. In a way it is, Boaz, would you, your loyalty and your power and your resources, would you cover my life? And in the ancient world, we do know that there was a commitment of this redeemer type person in a family. So what most likely is happening is some sort of commitment is beginning to emerge between Boaz and Ruth. But here's what Boaz says. In the middle of the night, waking up, and she's at his feet. Okay, that's why it could be a little comical, but anyway, hang in there with me. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness is greater than what you have showed earlier. You have not run after younger men. Boaz is older, okay? It's kind of a cool story. Whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that I ask. And I think that's the key of this story. Boaz will do all that is required of him, even if there's somebody else in line ahead of him. You'll find out Pastor Jason next week will tell the story, but it doesn't matter. Boaz is willing to put his love, his covering over this woman and bring her into his family. This story functions as a bit of gospel, good news for a Moabite woman who is grieving, who now has security, as you'll see at the end of Ruth. But you might wonder, oh, woman gets man. Beautiful story, happily ever after, but not quite. At least not for Naomi. Naomi in her grief says, I must do something to help Ruth, this foreigner. And she acts in a way, Naomi acts for the benefit of Ruth. But Naomi is still a widow. There's nobody for her. Scholars think that if Boaz cares for Ruth, because of the connection between Ruth and Naomi, Naomi will be provided for the rest of her life. But at this moment in the story, all we are told is that Naomi in her grief is still walking with her husband's memory absent from her story. But she's moving on. She acts for Ruth. So it's good news. This is a gospel story for me. And I think it is for all of us who find ourselves in the midst of the grief journey. Continuing on in life is possible. It's possible because of the small graces that God gives to us through one another. We can make progress, forward movement in grief because of those around us who are like Boaz or Ruth, offer us presents and loving acts of kindness that God uses to lift us up when we are bent low. I've listened to, walked with, and grieved with many, many people in my life. And what I have noticed is that hope often shows up in so many beautiful small ways. I shared a story of this little daughter, Erin. That's a heavy story. But for people walking through grief, hope shows up for them in maybe not so heavy ways. A phone call. Do you know the power of a well-timed phone call for somebody who is grieving? Particularly on the anniversary of their loss. That's powerful. That is a loving kindness that we bring to our sisters, our brothers, our family members, our colleagues, and our friends. It really matters to the grieving. A friend of mine, I knew for over 10 years, a dear friend, lost his life to COVID in 2021. Late 50s, family. I didn't get to see him because nobody was allowed in the hospital. It was heartbreaking. And when his wife said, "Rob, I'd want you to do the service," I had to say no because I had COVID myself. And so I did the homily via video. It wasn't a lot of fun. I wanted to be present. I wanted to be there for Brenda. But here's what I've noticed. Brenda still attends the church I attend to, but she never sits by herself. Because when you lose your spouse in the church, it's really a weird thing. You feel isolated, you feel invisible. Everything kind of happened in twos. It's just the way life goes. And then all of a sudden you become a one. And who do you sit with? Who do you socialize with? You always feel like you're like an odd cog in the system. But to this day, she never ever sits by herself. Because people know how to care for those who are grieving. And so someone always sits beside her. And when I see her, I've learned, and if you want a little tip, I don't have a lot of tips, but here's a tip if you're walking with people who are grieving. Don't be afraid to talk about grief. So I always ask this question, Brenda, how's your journey of grief today? And she just opens up her heart a little bit. Not the whole thing, because it's overwhelming. It's just a couple years old now. This is how God shows up in our grief, in the small graces that we give and offer to one another. Another friend, lost his son last year. It's hard. And I do the same thing with him. Tell me, Rob, how's your grief story going? And Meredith, I always ask. They want to talk, but sometimes they don't have permission. So as I think about this book of Ruth in chapter 3 today, I simply leave this with you today. Continuing on in the midst of grief is hard, but it's possible if we are carried by the community and the families that we are part of. It's possible to carry on because we receive the small graces of God through the loving compassion, just like Boaz, that comes to us in all kinds of small ways. We're able to carry on because people are present to us. We're able to take the next step in real life with grief because we're not alone. This is how the hidden, loving presence of God is with us. It happens through us. Would you join me in prayer? God is here with us. I invite you to pray. What is God saying to you this morning? And then the second prayer I invite you to pray. Who are you being invited to offer your presence and small graces so that God can care for those who grieve? Who are you being invited to love? God, we thank you for the loving, faithful, compassionate kindness of Boaz, who highlights your heart. And I ask that by the grace and the love of Christ today, for all of us, that we would have eyes and ears to see those who are grieving around us, and we might be present, fully present, without platitudes, but authentically present. And may you use our presence, O God, to help people continue on in the midst of grief. We ask this in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.